Welcome, everyone. You're in the webinar Climate Change and Migration, Two Interconnected Crises. I'm Dan Misla, Executive Director of Catholic Climate Covenant. Thank you for joining. Okay, I think we'll get going and allow other people to trickle in as they come. So again, my name's Dan Misla, Executive Director of Catholic Climate Covenant. I'm very honored to be able to host this webinar today. It's a timely topic. It's a critically important issue, this intersection between climate change and migration. And with this webinar, we also stand in solidarity with the campaign One Church, One Family, a Catholic public witness for immigrants. We're going to put the link to that campaign in the chat. The next event that they're hosting is November 13th, a week from tomorrow. So we hope that you will take a look at that and if possible, join or lead an effort in your community. We'll be sharing, this campaign is a national campaign, national Catholic campaign, calling people of faith to publicly demonstrate in solidarity with migrant families, asylum seekers, and refugees. It's essential to always be ready to hear both the cry of the earth and the cries of the poor. Before we begin, we have some housekeeping to do. This session is being recorded. A link will be sent to you within a day or two after the recording. So if you have registered, you will automatically get that link. If you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box, not the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A box. If you know who the question is directed to, please add that into your question. With such a large group gathering, we will not get to every question, but we'll try our best to get to most of them. The chat on the Zoom is available to you only to chat with others attending the session. Please remember to be civil in your interactions on the chat. Okay, let me first introduce our friend, Bishop Joseph Tyson. Bishop Tyson has been the bishop of the Diocese of Yakima since 2011. He serves as a member of the USCCB's Committee on Cultural Diversity, the Committee on Pastoral Care for Migrants, Refugees, and Travelers, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and Catholic Relief Services. And in his spare time, he's also the moderator for Catholic Climate Covenant, the Episcopal moderator. So he's a busy man, and we're always grateful that he can carve out time for us. Bishop Tyson, would you open us with a prayer?
Thanks. You're too gracious, Dan, and it's always good to place ourselves in the presence of God. The prayer is taken from one of the two prayers at the end of Laudato Si. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. It's titled A Prayer for the Earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and the forgotten of this earth. Our eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize you in all things, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop Tyson. So we have a great panel today, beginning with Bishop Tyson. And I will introduce people as we go. So you've heard the introduction to Bishop Tyson. So I'm going to ask him to present, and then I will introduce Jesus and Chloe in turn. So just also know that we're going to put longer bios for each of our speakers in the chat, so you can look at them there. So Bishop Tyson, I'm going to turn this over to you, and thank you again for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thanks to all of you for joining and for your heartfelt interest and support of the vision really led out in Laudato Si by Pope Francis. That really points us back to St. Francis of Assisi and to Christ himself. Here's my first point, and really the main point. Uh, we want to be much more conscious, I think, that the primary driver of migration is the climate crisis. In March 2020, the Integral Human Development Dicastery pointed out that the primary driver for migration was climate change. And, basically, I want to lay out there's three waves of migration: primary, secondary, and tertiary. And if you're doing my biography, I would say my primary qualification is simply my accompaniment with our own people here in the Diocese of Yakima here in Central Washington. We're about 75% Hispanic, and most people go to Mass in Spanish. In terms of primary migrate, the climate crisis being a primary driver of climate change, let me just give you two examples from my own life as bishop. I have two seminarians from Central America. They come from an area of Central America, Honduras and Guatemala, that many scholars and researchers consider the dry corridor. In other words, there's been a collapse of crops, a lack of water, vast changes in agriculture, civil unrest, social violence, extortion, various ways of people surviving in the midst of a severe climate crisis. One of my seminarians, uh, had migrated into a city in Honduras after leaving a rural area where they couldn't farm anymore. And then he was ended up being pressured and trafficked by gangs. He came north, ended up working in the town of Kennewick, Washington, in the Diocese of Yakima, and he's currently in application for a T status. He risks being in conflict with gangs were he to return. Now, if you talk to him, he would say it was gang violence, but behind it is simply living in the dry corridor. Second example would be a priest from a seminary from Guatemala. Again, rural Guatemala, his principal language was Caraval. He was kidnapped by extortionists who were trying to raise money. His parents borrowed $50,000 to pay the kidnappers. He was released. They borrowed money to pay the 50,000. He was released. A new extortion threat emerged, and so they paid one of the extortionists, who was a coyote, to come north. He learned how to speak Spanish well, picking apples in Mattawa, Washington. And then he worked as a waiter in a restaurant, and you have to know English to get the order straight. So he mastered his English there. And he also had a couple of girlfriends who, this is prior to coming to seminary, and I think they helped him with his English. Um, but in a certain sense, being the driver of this dry corridor in Central America, this climate crisis, is what's behind the civil unrest, the cartel activity, and the violence and kidnapping that our people face. Um, and of course, I think they're going to make fine priests because, it's good to remember that St. Paul picks up imagery from human trafficking to describe God's dramatic action sending us Jesus to free us and save us. We can't pay our own ransom. We can't save ourselves. This is really at the heart of our Christian faith in the story of Jesus, and they know this in their bones from their lives. That's kind of the primary migration. Secondary migration. Let me give you an example of this. Mattawa, Washington is I'm sorry, Bridgeport, Washington is one of the towns in my diocese where there are no masses in Bridgeport in English. 2 years ago, the earth literally was drying out. Most of the folks in Bridgeport are from the state of Guerrero, which some of you would know would be a place where that's been scarred by significant cartel violence. Again, agricultural instability, better prices for drugs than for regular crops. Many people migrated north from Guerrero into Bridgeport. Literally, the earth dried out around Bridgeport. And we had a very hot summer. It was the same summer in British Columbia that Leololette, central British Columbia, through a terrible fire. The town was surrounded by fire. 15 of our parishioners lost their trailers. Most of the housing is trailers. So they were sent on a secondary migration. Again, the factor is the change in the climate and really the emerging climate crisis. And there's kind of a tertiary migration going on. I have a priest now. He crossed the border with his parents when he was 11 and became a seminarian for another diocese. That diocese helped him to asked him to self-deport. He studied as a priest in Mexico. I got to know him because I send seminarians to the same seminary, my undocumented men. That diocese decided to drop him. I picked him up. He came north on an R1 visa. His parents continued to live in their hometown here in the US. But due to the hostile environment and changes in economics, after 30 years or so, his parents are returning to Mexico, and they're actually going to end up in the town they left, you know, due to a lack of economic opportunity. Now they're of retirement age, so they're going to be living back in the town they left some 30 years ago. Sadly, my priest is in a change of status with his R1 and cannot go back to help them resettle without risking a non-reentry because he's got on a green card application in. So those are just a little, just a snapshot of the way in which climate change and the climate crisis, in simple ways that I'm seeing as a bishop, are really pushing the 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 uh, the migration here in the north and migration globally. Let me just kind of pivot a little bit. Um, know that we are the severity of the migration crisis. Um, David Spicer is on with us today, so he would know this. The USCCB Migration Refugee Services co-sponsored a report with um, the National Association of Evangelicals, the Center for Study of Global Christianity at the Gordon Cornell Theological Seminary, World Relief, looking at those that are be at risk of being deported. And basically, in the United States, the study suggests that 1 in 12 families, uh, Christian families, could be deported. It's about 1 in 6 Catholics in the Diocese of Yakima. It's between 1 in 2 and 1 in 3 families facing someone that is in the shadow of a deportation. So there's the growing threat of this tertiary migration back to where people came from is very real. And they're returning to places that could not sustain them, which is what pushed them to leave to begin with. Let me just maybe pivot to Catholic social teaching on this point. Really, there are three interlocking principles: the right of people to migrate in order to sustain their lives and their families, the right of a country to regulate its borders, and then each nation's duty to regulate migration with justice and mercy. The overall people, however, and this was noted in Together on a Journey of Faith, Strangers No Longer from 2005, folks have a right to immigrate when they're in conditions that they cannot support their families. And the first principle in that document was that the conditions should be such in their families, in their countries, that they shouldn't be forced to immigrate. I would just uplift a second piece of Catholic social teaching going back to John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, in his moral theology encyclical, uh, uh, Veritatis Splendor, points out that deportation is an intrinsic moral evil. Now, nuancing on that, there can be reasons for the common good that there would be some people deported, but overall, this is a moral evil, intrinsically morally evil. John Paul II followed up on that in a 1996 statement on migrants, talking about the primary obligation that we have to welcome those who are fleeing and to be compassionate, understanding of why people migrate. So it's just a reminder how long term this has been and how long we've been preaching this in a variety of ways. I think the difficulty isn't in our teaching. The difficulty really is working with our culture and finding ways to dialogue and have Catholic social teachings being received with open hearts by our fellow citizens and sometimes even by our fellow Catholics. Let me close with this point. Pope Benedict, in his very first homily back in April 2005, said this: "The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast." Pope Benedict had a marvelous synthetical mind of bringing together what's happening to us and our minds, our hearts, our souls, and what's happening to literally the desertification of the world. That there is an interconnectedness between our treatment of the environment and our very well-being, our very spiritual lives. Perhaps this is why Pope Francis so eloquently noted that the cry of the earth is the cry of the poor. This is why the church is very clear in its own review of data that the primary driver of migration today is the climate crisis. Thanks for considering the points I've raised, and I'm going to give this back to you, Dan, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Bishop Tyson. Whenever I hear you talk about this, I'm struck by a couple of things. One is just the heart-wrenching experiences that folks in your diocese are going through, with migrating here, migrating internally in the diocese, and then having to sometimes return. And also, the challenge you gave to all of us, not just those of us on this call, but all people of goodwill, to open our hearts. I will say without apology that what's happening with this administration on immigration is heartless. So we just need to find ways to open our hearts and have conversations with others about that. So thank you so much. That was really a great way to open this. I want to turn now to Jesus de la Torre. He's the Assistant Director for Global Migration at the Hope Border Institute, which is a strategic center for faith leaders pursuing justice at the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Jesus will focus on the migration crisis at the border and how the church is responding. So, Jesus, your turn. You're up.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks so much to the Catholic Climate Covenant for the invitation to be here with all of you today. And thanks so much to Bishop Tyson and to Chloe for their incredible contributions and reflections. It's my pleasure to be with you all today to talk about the situation at the border. Bishop Tyson was speaking about deserts, and where we are based in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, we are based on a desert. But it's a desert that is full of life, despite what many may want to believe. However, very lately, in the past couple of decades, this desert has also become a place of death. Many people who are trying to seek safety, including the people that Bishop Tyson was speaking about, were people who didn't find any other pathways, didn't find any other migration pathways available to them. And eventually they had to cross the border, and eventually many of them have died. Over the past couple of years in El Paso, we have seen an increase in migrant deaths. In fiscal year 2024, 196 people were found dead at the border, migrants who were trying to seek safety. Half of them were women in the El Paso sector, which covers El Paso and New Mexico. During this past fiscal year, we started to work with the Diocese of El Paso, with the Scalabrinian sisters, with parishioners in the community to simply drop water, try to drop things, food that could help migrants or could help anyone in distress at the desert to save their lives, to continue living, because most of the people who have died at the desert and in our communities have died because of dehydration and because of the exposure to high temperatures. And as you know, due to climate change, temperatures are getting hotter every year in El Paso and along the border in many of our communities. And that is resulting in more people dying when they are trying to cross, seeking safety. And probably you have seen lately that border crossings have gone down. And yet the reality is one of deaths for people who are trying to seek safety. According to data from Border Patrol and No More Deaths, 39 people were found in this past fiscal year, 2025, despite the low border crossings. However, we know that when people are trying to cross, when people are dying at our shores, it's not only because of the heat, it's not only because of this deadly climate change, it's also because of the lack of available migration pathways, the lack of access to asylum, and especially now, the implementation of policies only focused on enforcement, militarization, and pushing people away. And this year, we're facing increasing challenges, as you all may well know. At the border, there is no access to asylum, a basic human right, which means that people can cross a border and try to seek safety. As a result, many families are stranded on the other side of the border in Ciudad Juarez. They are being kidnapped, some of them, and they are struggling to secure jobs and housing and education for their kids. We have also seen an increase in militarization of our border. Not only we have agents from the Army deployed, now the administration is creating what it's called national defense areas or national security areas, which basically means that anyone entering these areas, which people cannot tell because they are not marked, there are only small signs. Anyone entering there could be prosecuted for entering a military base. And therefore, migrants who are trying to seek safety and seek asylum, they could be prosecuted for entering these areas. And the landscape has become also one of militarization. At the border, we have seen the deployment of striker vehicles, we have seen the deployment of drones, and we have seen the deployment of the army overall and the National Guard in our communities. At the same time, many people are being deported through the border, including to Ciudad Juarez. And some of those people have been people who lived in the United States for decades, not just years, decades. We are hearing the stories of men who lived in the US for 40 years, people who arrived in the United States 70 years ago, and they have grown in the United States, and that's the only place they know and they call home. And we have also seen the cases of families being separated during the deportation processes, where moms are detained and the kids are left behind. And now they face the increasingly challenging situations of deciding what they're going to do and how they're going to reunite with their family members. Right now, we are hearing more people thinking about how they're going to go back with their family members. And some of these people are thinking about crossing and risking their lives in the desert because that's the only option sometimes available to them. And as we know, and as Bishop Tyson wonderfully explained, our faith calls us to a new response, calls us to center the person, to think about the lives of all these people seeking safety, of all the families, all our immigrant neighbors in the United States, and all those who are trying to pursue better opportunities and eventually protection in other countries. And based on that, let me tell you very briefly what we are trying to do at the Hope Border Institute together with our faith community in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and along the migration journey. First of all, we're trying to respond to the realities, to the humanitarian concerns. We did a food drive recently. More than 500 people benefited from that. And it was funded through the joint fund that we have with the Diocese of El Paso, the Border Refugee Assistance Fund, is privately funded, and thanks to generous donations, we're able to do a food drive. We are also, together with our colleagues in Ciudad Juarez, accompanying several cases. One of them, for example, was the case of a Venezuelan mom. She was detained in New York. She was sent to the border. She was 8 months pregnant, and eventually she was deported to Ciudad Juarez. She gave birth in Ciudad Juarez, but she had a lot of pain. And she had a lot of pain because her 2 little kids were left behind in New York, and she didn't have a way to reunite with them. Thanks to the work of our team and to the work of a wonderful team of lawyers, we were able to reunite them. And now the mom is with her 2 kids and her newborn, and she's on her way back to other places because now she cannot go back to the US to seek safety. So those are some of the concrete realities that we are trying to respond to at the immediate level. At the same time, we're working to protect our communities and protecting especially from unrestrained immigration enforcement. Many places are now places of raids. People could be detained in many circumstances, and it's important that everyone knows their constitutional rights. It's true, violations of rights are more common, but still, everyone needs to know that they do have rights, and it's important to exert them and to know them. And together with our faith community, we are advocating precisely so people can access care, pastoral care, especially when they are in detention, when they are going through very hard times, sometimes after being separated from their families. We're advocating and we're working to restore access to asylum at the border. And we are for sure also working to end border deaths, especially ensuring that our local practitioners and respondents, they have access to the right materials to rescue migrants. But we are also going beyond that as well. We are trying to mobilize our voices. We are trying to mobilize our communities to be a prophetic voice for justice. We really believe that the moment demands a prophetic voice that says that another reality is possible, and these policies should not be the default option for our situation. And let me tell you briefly about something that we did recently. We collected testimonies of members of our communities, members of our immigrant community at the border, California, in North Carolina, in Iowa, and we asked them a simple question: how you feel and what you want us to do? What do you want the church, all of us here today, to do with you? Their answers were plenty, but many people expressed the need for support, the need for accompaniment, and overall the need to speak publicly about what's happening, to stand publicly in solidarity with them. We were very proud to bring all these testimonies, all the letters to the Holy Father this past October. And I want to bring the words of the Holy Father back to you all, because I think they are really important. And he said to the group, the church cannot remain silent. We cannot remain silent. And hey, very recently, he's been advocating for access to pastoral care in detention, and he's been advocating for fair policies. So it's up to us. It's up to all of us here in this call and to all of our communities to not remain silent, to stand with our migrant brothers and sisters, and to keep working for justice, especially in the current moment. And I'll be happy to answer any questions after and follow along the conversation. Thanks very much.
Jesus, thank you. As I said before we opened up the call, the Hope Border Institute is doing amazing work on the border, and thank you for your witness and your challenges to us. We're really, really grateful for that. Lastly, I want to introduce Chloe Noel. She's the environmental research and policy advisor at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Chloe's going to focus on the macro issues driving global migration and how climate is a part of that, a big part of that. And we'll highlight some of the work of CRS and their projects related to climate resilience and the refugee fund and refugee relief. Chloe's been a wonderful advocate. She's been in this job, about 6 months or so, Chloe? And we've been really grateful for that partnership. So Chloe, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks. You're muted, Chloe.
Okay. Let me see what you were saying. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Okay. You're
There
seeing my.
Great.
I'm so sorry. No,
it's you're all good. Just
okay.
yeah.
So I really agree with what Bishop Tyson said before about how climate is a major and perhaps the biggest driver of migration. When you think about the intersectionality of how climate can drive conflicts, how climate can drive economic challenges, that these together can drive migration and especially out migration. But overall, most climate migrants are internally displaced. And just the number of forced movements of people due to disasters between 2015 and 2024 was 264.8 million. And 89% were displaced by flooding and storms, while a smaller amount were displaced by earthquakes or wildfires, for instance. And by the end of 2024, there were 9.8 million people living in internal displacement. These numbers are for 2024 are the highest on record that that have been recorded by the Institute for Displacement Monitoring Center. And in the US, we made up the largest number of forced movements in the world due to disasters over 2024. And 22,000 remain internally displaced in the United States by the end of last year. When we think about the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, for example, and how in the lower Ninth Ward, people have not come back. So people remain displaced and are not returning. And who is the most vulnerable? We see that it is obviously the poor in the United States and around the world, and especially women and children are very vulnerable, and children face a lot of challenges in the process of being displaced. If they're separated from a parent, that they can face safety issues such as abuse or trafficking, and access to education and food security, and the ability to have safe places to even play. Women and girls are very vulnerable because of their gender, that they can face gender-based violence, trafficking and exploitation. Women may not have sufficient access to water and food for, especially for lactating mothers, and girls can be vulnerable to increased rates of early forced child marriage and unions. And that's especially the case in places that are highly climate vulnerable and also fragile states. And then also people with disabilities are vulnerable and may face challenges with movement or the ability to communicate. And older adults are also vulnerable, again, because of mobility issues, perhaps. And what we really need are psychosocial supports for communities. They need safe housing, safe passage in those processes. And what can we be doing to respond? We can invest in planning to reduce risk and impact. In the United States, recently, communities, indigenous communities, the Yupik up in Alaska, were faced these storm surges from a typhoon from Japan that hit them. And these were communities that were already thinking about or making plans to relocate away from where they were living because of ice melting and sea level rise and storm surges. And they, in fact, got a grant from the United States to support that effort at planning and relocation and building resilience. But those grants were canceled this year, unfortunately. Then there's also Tuvalu, which is one of the most vulnerable countries, a small island state in Asia that will face extreme sea level rise that could go underwater. And they are also planning for relocation. And the environmental minister from Tuvalu was at the Raising Hope gathering and just talked about the existential crisis that that this is presenting for people who live on the island. And they've actually made a deal with Australia to get climate visas, and they're giving out a certain allotment per year to residents on Tuvalu to move to Australia if they want to, but they're also making investments in Tuvalu to create resilience for communities there that don't want to leave, because Catholic social teaching, which was much better communicated by Bishop Tyson, that people have the right to migrate and also the right to stay where they live and to live with dignity. I didn't mention that indigenous peoples, which is indicated here with these examples, are also highly vulnerable because they may lose sacred places, they may lose sacred traditions and cultures in that process of the climate impacts and forced displacement. But there's also solutions. Catholic Relief Services is making investments in communities to help them become more resilient to climate change. In the Central American Dry Corridor, where they face extreme droughts that impact lives and livelihoods, they're also very vulnerable to hurricanes. And they were affected by hurricanes Eta and Iota a few years ago, and thanks to support from USAID, they were able to create safer housing and water infrastructure for community members. And they also were able to make investments in climate resilient livelihoods for community members and giving them technical training and also empowering them in being able to create plans and early warning systems to act on in the case of a hurricane or in these cases of extreme drought. And hopefully by taking these resilience measures that communities will be better prepared for the next storm. And then in the Philippines, they are also working with another USAID project on sustainable climate resilient communities and working to cultivate mangroves and planting those as a way to create climate resilience that can prevent houses from being washed away by storm surges and typhoons. And they believe that those efforts have made a difference. They're also getting access to climate data to be able to inform responses and again, support to create disaster risk reduction plans and early warning systems so that they can be better prepared to protect communities. And another thing that we really need is climate finance. And as you can see here, there is a huge adaptation gap, which is the funding that really supports building resilience for communities. Meanwhile, you have a lot more investments in mitigation to help reduce emissions, and that is extremely important. But a lot of those investments are coming especially from private sector because there is a profit motivation. They see a return on investment by investing in mitigation, and especially in low-income communities and low-income countries, they really need to have public grant-based funding to support adaptation efforts. And they created a new goal for finance that by 2035, they will produce $300 billion a year, which really is not very much, especially when you compare that to what the real needs are. Now they have a secondary goal of creating 1.3 trillion by 2035, which does seem more on par with what the needs will probably be, if not still a little bit low. And that is going to greatly depend on reforms of development banks to create more innovative sources of finance. It will probably mean greater amounts of private finance involved. And with that comes concerns around safeguarding of communities, of human rights, and making sure that those finances are accountable to the very people that they want to support. And then another piece of this is loss and damage finance. Just a couple of years ago, the UN and all the climate negotiators established a fund for loss and damage. And we're at this point where our mitigation efforts have not been enough. Adaptation in some cases is not enough. And especially for those communities like in Alaska and Tuvalu, where now you're at this point where you're looking at irreversible climate impacts that need loss and damage specific funding. And at this point, there's $800 million that has been committed. There's not a finance goal that's part of this collective effort at this point, even though it's something that many countries, especially the low-income countries, have been fighting for, that would be included in any collective goal. And the negotiations are about to start again at COP30 in Brazil on November 10th, and Catholic Relief Services and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops just put out our COP30 statement that says we need more investments in adaptation. We need to commit to ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We need to pledge more finance for loss and damage. And we need to make sure that any finance is transparent, that it's timely, that it really meets the needs of people on the ground, that it is locally led, and that it does not add additional debt to communities. Some of the policy challenges that we face to addressing the needs of communities so that they do not have to migrate and can have that resilience are foreign assistance cuts. I didn't mention that those Catholic Relief Services projects have now been canceled because of USAID being closed. So we are continuing to advocate for foreign assistance there have also been cuts to domestic programs to incentivize reducing emissions and for building resilience, especially in communities of color, low-income communities in both rural and urban environments, and communities who are affected by the energy transition. But that funding was cut in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And there's also regulatory rollbacks happening. There's a proposal to end what they call the endangerment finding at the Environmental Protection Agency, which would basically take away the rationale and the tools that the US has to regulate greenhouse gases. And a second one is the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, which has the large sources of greenhouse gases, especially from industry, that they have to report what those emissions are. And that is key for us to track our emissions, to put together plans to reduce emissions, and to report to global bodies such as the UN as part of our Paris Agreement commitments, as well as for states and industries to also create and set targets. And we have been weighing in on these rules, or these proposed rule changes. We weighed in on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to try to protect clean energy tax credits for dioceses that want to transition to solar and wind energy, and to protect those environmental justice grants, because we know that that funding is so important for communities on the ground. And then climate refugees that's not a recognized status currently on the global level. And just this year, the Trump administration has allocated the smallest number of refugee spots than we've really had in our history, at least in recent history. So that is going to make it much more challenging for people on the move to find safety in the United States. And I know my colleagues, Jesus and David, could probably answer more questions on that part. But Pope Leo XIV said at this recent gathering, the Raising Hope gathering in Castel Gandolfo, to celebrate the 10 years of Laudato Si, that everyone in society must put pressure on governments to develop and implement more rigorous regulations, procedures, and controls. And citizens must take an active role in decision making in order for it to be possible to mitigate the damage done to the environment. So in terms of recommendations, we need to invest in resilience, adaptation, and peace. Pope Leo talked quite a bit about that in his World Day of Care for Creation message that was focused on seeds of peace and hope. We need to continue to reduce emissions through regulatory efforts and things that we can even do in our own personal lives to reduce emissions, to move away from a throwaway culture, that there are things that we can continue to do. We need to have plans to reduce climate impacts during emergencies and for orderly relocation. We need solidarity and centering of displaced people and vulnerable populations in any climate policy or migration policies. And we need to think about our refugee and immigration policies that Jesus, spoke about a bit before, and the challenges that's faced or created for families in the United States and around the world. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thanks for both the challenges and the hope that we've heard from you, and also about what we can do in terms of public policy. We're grateful that the Bishops' Conference is stepping out as much as they have currently and in the past, frankly. So that's all been great. I also want to just point out that if you have not joined the Covenants Encounter campaign, which is our advocacy work, please do so. Pause post that so you can click on that and sign up, and you'll be kept informed of what we're doing. Just recently, for example, we helped with a sign-on letter by dozens of Catholic organizations to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, asking him to reconsider join in the talks in Bellum that'll start this week. So lots going on, and we're grateful for the partnerships that we have with Catholic Relief Services and the Bishops' Conference and so many others. We have a few minutes for questions, and we probably won't get to all of them. And now they're coming in fast and furious. I was trying to keep tabs, but I'm not sure I'll be able to do that. The first question for Bishop Tyson, and this was asked by a couple of people in a couple of different ways, but how can we, lay people, how can we urge our priests to speak up? How can we engage others on this issue, including the bishops? How would you answer that? And you have answered that in the Q&A, to the individual, but maybe for the group, if you could say something more about that.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a great question. And as I often joke, I think I can say this. Probably my colleagues would not be able to say this with humor that I do. At USCCB, it's two bishops, three opinions. So it really does take a tremendous amount of dialogue and conversation and patience. But I guess the other thing that I mentioned in trying to address some of this in the Q&A box, stories are usually, I think, are more effective. I did a little eight town immigration forum using the synodal process, where each person that I use priests because they're the safest to be able to speak publicly. I had each of my priests speak 15 minutes, 2 to 3 priests, about their migration journey. Many have crossed the border without authorization and had to self-deport and then re-enter their local vocations. They tell the story of what it's like to cross the border. And then I have the parishioners simply say what they heard. No crosstalk, no response, no debate. They simply hear from each other which piece of the migration story touched their heart. And so what I'm telling people is this is not, we're not talking about a political narrative. We're talking about a biblical narrative, how their migration matches the great migration story of sacred scripture. I think, folks who I know have been special parishioners who have written me a lot on this topic, they're a little bit more receptive to hearing a story. You can argue politics, you can even argue church teaching, but you really can't argue with somebody's immigration story. So I would say that is the key. I think that's going to unlock some of this. And it isn't, how do I say this? Y'all know I have said a lot, a lot, but folks tune it out.
Yeah.
That's why I really think it really is incumbent on us finding ways to get parishioners to talk to each other. Great question.
Yeah. Yeah, the synodal process certainly can be helpful with that. A question, let's see, are there any, and I'm not sure who this would go to, maybe you, Jesus, but or David, are there any organizations that can help us with migration awareness programs for youth? Like, do we have anything out there that could be helpful?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. We'll be happy to connect about it. We're working locally with some of the schools, with our parishes, with our diocese. So we're working with a wide variety of actors. There are also other organizations doing a specific work with Catholic youth, especially the Ignatian Solidarity Network. They are usually great and they have a lot of resources. So I encourage you to connect with them, Ignatian Solidarity Network. But we'll be also very happy to connect and explore any options of programs and programming or resources as well.
If I
Great.
could just
Jesus,
pipe in, I would not underestimate the importance of regular pastoral care. I had a call from a youth. He's on the football team. He's here legally. The coach noticed a great player, but the coach saw him break down crying in the sideline. And I ended up talking to him. He's so concerned about his own fate because his parents are considering self-deportation. So it's just we all have to just be really present to those pastoral moments.
Yeah. Jesus, if you could send us, maybe pause some of those links that you just discussed, I think that'd be great. And thank you, Bishop Tyson, for that intervention. Has anyone, this is a question, has anyone studied the impact of the recent cuts in U.S. Overseas Development Assistance, USAID, on migration figures? It seems intuitively that those cuts have resulted in increased migration, but is there any data to support that? I'm not sure Jose, Jesus or David. I don't know if you have,
I did see
if that's
from
been studied, or Chloe.
Refugees International did put out a blog piece looking at some of those impacts. If I can find it, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, we just have a couple minutes left. Let me see. And Chloe,
Put in the
you had a
chat
figure
box
of,
that I would leave it up to my colleagues on that, but there's always a
yeah,
data lag. So there
yeah,
probably is an impact. It's just
sure,
that it can be up to a year to get good peer-reviewed data to know the impact.
great. Yeah,
And one other
that,
thing just to
that's
keep in mind is that UNHCR, the UN agency that monitors refugee flows, they've experienced really significant cuts, largely as a result of the cuts to US government funding. And so organizations such as UNHCR and IOM, the International Organization for Migration, that often collect this data, it's become more difficult for them to do so. So that's just also something to keep in mind in terms of getting data based on some of these impacts.
great. Hopefully this will also have a quick answer. The question is sanctuary totally eliminated? I'm wondering if the person meant asylum. How can we support reestablishment for a unified voice on this? I think sanctuary is a different term. That's usually what local folks do, provide sanctuary to immigrants, but I think they might have meant asylum.
So the ability to request asylum still exists. As Jesus mentioned, along the US-Mexico border, it's almost entirely been restricted as a result of executive actions taken by the president. That is currently being litigated in the courts, and it is possible that at least some of those restrictions are lifted at some point. Under federal statute, though, asylum is still very much what it was prior to the start of this year. So the federal ability to request, or the federal law regarding asylum, is still the same, but of course the way that restrictions have been placed on the ability to request asylum by this administration are what has changed. People who are in the interior of the United States are still able to submit an application for asylum with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and they continue to process those even during the government shutdown. And people who are in immigration court proceedings, who are in removal proceedings or deportation proceedings, are also still requesting asylum as a defense to those proceedings.
Great. Thank you, David. Folks, we are out of time. What a wonderful, let's give a virtual applause for our panelists and for David for joining us to add a little more color to our conversation. It's been delightful to be your host. Challenging times. Let's keep hope alive. And we will send this recording out in the next day or two, along with some of the resources that were mentioned. We'll put those in an email to you. So thank you for your attention. Thanks for, again, to the panelists, and we'll see you next time around. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.